When the United States was formed, it promised that all men were created equal. What about the woman? That was a question that came to primary focus in one of America's most dynamic suffragist leaders, Alice Paul. Alice Paul's leadership led to the passage of the 19th Amendment and left a legacy of a greater opportunity in the rights of women. The quest for women's rights and equality began in 1848 when a group led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton met in Seneca Falls, New York. Stanton and other women were not supposed to speak in public or be involved in political issues, such as abolishing slavery. Many other men and women agreed with Stanton that women should have a public voice. The group met and rewrote the Declaration of Independence. They called it the Declaration of Sentiments. It was the beginning of women's suffrage movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony became two of the most important leaders for women's suffrage. They sat at meetings, spoke in front of people, and wrote editorials and newsletters. After many years, women still had little rights. In 1870, Susan B. Anthony was able to vote in the presidential election, was arrested, and fined $100. She never paid her fine. For over the next 30 years, women gradually received more rights. Some Western states allowed women to vote in towns, states, and school board elections. Women were gaining the right to keep their own property in case of divorce. But universal suffrage, or the right of all women to vote in the United States, did not happen. One woman, Alice Paul, became dissatisfied with this situation. Alice Paul, born in 1885, was a highly intelligent woman who earned not only a doctorate, but also 3 law degrees. Between 1907 and 1909, Alice traveled to England to work and learn from the British suffragists. While in England, Alice met a woman named Emma Goldin and her husband Richard Parkhurst. Emma was a suffragist that did things differently than American suffragists. In England, instead of just trying to talk, British suffragists such as Emma went on hunger strikes, threw parades, and even destroyed public property. When Alice heard this was working, she decided that it would work in America as well. After joining the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, Paul organized a small group called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. Within months, Alice's tactics became too extreme for the NAWSA, so the two groups split in 1914. Besides the difference in tactics, the NAWSA believed that changing state laws would be more effective in increasing women's rights. Under Paul's leadership, a huge parade was planned on the day before Woodrow Wilson's second inauguration. Thousands of women across the nation attended the parade, putting suffrage into the headlines. Many men and women disagreed with Alice's continued protest, feeling it was unpatriotic. The authorities ordered the arrest of the women picketing outside the White House. The women were sent to a prison where the situation was horrible. While in prison, Alice Paul led women in hunger strikes to protest their lack of the right to vote. Many of the women, including Alice, became ill. Alice was eventually sent to a psychiatric ward. Publicity about their treatment soon spread around the nation. In 1917, more than 70 suffragists have been imprisoned in Occoquan Workhouse for picketing the White House for the right to vote. Reports of inhumane conditions being force-fed at the workhouse had been reported in the news. Woodrow Wilson could no longer ignore Alice Paul and the need for the nationwide amendment of women's suffrage. This became the turning point in the struggle for the 19th Amendment. Woodrow Wilson agreed to campaign for the passage of women's suffrage amendment. Then, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally passed by Congress. Alice Paul continued her leadership in getting the amendment passed by 36 states. The newly passed amendment stated that the right of citizens in the United States will not be denied by their gender. After the 19th Amendment was passed, Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party thought about disbanding. However, Alice still had a vision for greater equality. She knew that even though this law was passed, women were still getting paid less than men. Alice also knew that many women were denied their rights. In 1923, Alice proposed an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. Overcoming the opposition of women's organizations who feared the loss of protective legislation, she helped gain acceptance in platforms of both major political parties in 1944. However, it took many more decades before Congress passed the ERA, only to have it fail enough states to vote for it in order to pass. Her legacy showed other individuals who followed how to push for a social and legal change. Others followed her tactics of picketing the White House, facing imprisonment, hunger strikes, and the use of the media. One historian noted that prohibition might not have passed if women had not had the vote. More and more women were elected to offices. One failed legacy of Alice Paul was the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. She sought to add an amendment that removed all discrimination based on gender from the U.S. Constitution. That fight continued with other laws at federal, state, and local levels. Alice Paul inspired new generations of women's rights activists.